Good morning. Welcome to today's subcommittee hearing entitled Improving Oversight of the Regulatory Process, Lessons from State Legislatures. This hearing provides an opportunity to do something Washington should do more often. Listen. Listen and try to learn to see what states do well, especially when it pertains to regulations. Today we have 3 states that have found effective ways for their legislatures to provide oversight over state rulemaking agencies. Strong and effective legislative oversight doesn't mean stopping agencies from issuing rules. And it does not mean we must have an adversarial relationship with regulators. When regulators do not trust or work with the legislature, they push the bounds of their authority. This leads to lawsuits challenging nearly every aspect of rulemaking, which draws out the process, creating uncertainty for individuals and our communities. On the other hand, as we will hear today, a cooperative relationship between agencies and the legislative body leads to more effective and efficient rules that follow legislative intent and incorporate the views of regulated parties. Regulators working closely with the legislature result in regulations that face far fewer lawsuits from stakeholders. The onus to improve the rulemaking process is not just on the regulators. As legislators, we must fulfill our responsibility to actually legislate. For decades, we've fallen into the habit of passing legislation that's vague on the details and tell the agencies to do the hard work and figure out how to be able to apply it. Politically, this insulates the legislature, and we can say that we did our part, but the agency messed up the implementation. It's not how government's supposed to work. Many states, like Connecticut, North Dakota, actively review state regulations to ensure they follow legislative intent. Other states, like Idaho, codify state regulations a year after they expire, or they expire. This causes the legislature to take responsibility for not only the bills they pass, but also for the regulations that are a direct result of those laws. When we talk about regulatory reform, I frequently hear assertions that changes to our system will result in the ossification of the rulemaking process, clog the courts, prevent agencies from issuing needed regulations, or create significant risk to health, safety, or the environment. But many of the ideas that we have considered in committee are already being used in success on the state level. And I think we can learn a lot today from this. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So over the past 3 years, we've been leading this committee. We've spent a lot of time examining the regulatory process, from the basic framework of the rulemaking process to the doctrines that are applied in court to the nitty-gritty of how decisions are made on an agency level. From these examinations, legislators have legislation's flowed, trying to adopt different ideas that's been discussed in those hearings. What we have not done enough of is look beyond the process in Washington. This hearing is a great way to learn about the activities of our partners in governance, the states, to learn about how they've tackled many of the same questions that we've considered in this committee, and to basically let the laboratories, the 50 laboratories of government, work and inform some of the practices that we do right here. If anyone's been following this committee, they know that frequently I ask about the intersection between federal regulation and state regulation, because a lot of the challenges that we have here for over-regulation or duplicative regulation or inconsistent regulation is really that push between state and local regulation and federal regulation. And a lot of us believe that if the state is already protecting public health and safety, that that's the level at which those institutions are most accountable. And so we definitely want to hear not only your opinion about what you do, but maybe some of the frustration about the duplication that you see in regulatory effort with federal regulation. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, congratulations. It's a great opportunity for us to learn a lot more about how things could work better and how we could work better with state regulators.
That's great. Thank you. At this time, we'll proceed with testimony from our witnesses. It is a tradition of this committee and the custom to be able to swear in all witnesses that appear before us, so I would ask all 3 of you to please stand and raise your right hand. You swear the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect all the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Representative O'Neill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, Ranking Member Heitkamp, Chairman, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. I'm a 27-year veteran of the Legislative Regulation Review Committee of Connecticut and have previously served 6 years as co-chairman of the committee. The Connecticut General Assembly first began reviewing regulations in 1945. The Secretary of State was required to submit to each General Assembly all the regulations promulgated during the preceding biennium for its study, legislature meeting only biennially. Any regulation which the General Assembly disapproved was void and not reissued. In 1963, the first Regulations Review Committee was established by statute. This committee was and is a bicameral, bipartisan committee. It met during the interim between the sessions and could only disapprove regulations that were already in effect. Disapproval voided the regulation unless the General Assembly overrode the committee's action at its next session. But the General Assembly was not required to act on voided regulations. In 1971, the current Legislative Regulations Review Committee was created pursuant to the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act, which we adopted. Under the 1971 law, the committee was authorized to review proposed regulations. The committee's disapproval of a regulation in 1976 led to a lawsuit challenging the legislature's role on constitutional grounds, alleging a breach of the separation of powers principle. The Connecticut Superior Court ruled that the committee's activity was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court overturned that lower court decision, but they did so on technical grounds, leaving the issue of constitutionality unresolved until 1982, when a constitutional amendment approved by the electorate became effective and confirmed the legislature's authority to consider and disapprove administrative regulations. The Regulation Review Committee was established to ensure proper legislative review of proposed agency regulations. Administrative regulations have the force of law, therefore closer scrutiny and control of the legislative branch by the legislative branch is clearly in the public interest to ensure that regulations do not contravene legislative intent. The committee, which meets monthly, consists of 14 members, 6 senators and 8 House members. There are equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. There are 2 co-chairs, a Republican and a Democrat, one from each chamber. Each term, the co-chairs alternate, so the senator becomes the member of the opposite party, and the House member does the same thing. This is a system of subcommittees which usually consist of 2 members, a Republican and a Democrat from each chamber. The subcommittees are assigned to specific agencies. The subcommittees review and, if necessary, make changes to the regulations. The regulations and other required documents are provided to each committee member at least 1 month prior to the meeting at which the action is to be taken. Legal opinions and recommendations from our legal staff and fiscal analysis from our fiscal staff are provided to us 10 days before such meeting. The committee can take the following types of action: approve in whole or in part, approve with technical corrections, reject without prejudice, or disapprove. Approval in part allows the committee to make deletions. When deletions are made, sections or subsections are deleted, not individual words. The committee cannot add words to a regulation. Technical changes are sometimes needed to correct spelling, punctuation, statutory references, and matters of style. Frequently, regulations are rejected without prejudice for a lack of statutory authority. Rejection without prejudice requires the agency to resubmit the regulation with appropriate corrections within either 35 or 65 days, depending on whether the regulation is mandatory or permissive. There is no limit to the number of times that a regulation can be rejected without prejudice. Disapproval is rare and signifies the committee's interpretation that the proposed regulation is without statutory basis. Disapproval requires the regulation to be sent to an appropriate committee of the legislature for consideration during the next legislative session. The General Assembly then has the option to sustain or reverse the Regulation Review Committee's action. Inaction by the legislature sustains the action of the committee. The committee meets as necessary to consider emergency regulations. The committee functions as intended. It is effective as a mechanism to protect the legislative intent from executive branch dilution or distortion. It provides an opportunity for individuals interested in or affected by a regulation to influence the process without the time and expense of litigation. The committee's bipartisan and bicameral structure enhances its effectiveness. Some agency staffers who must deal with the Regulations Review Committee do not want to deal with the committee and the additional process that we require. I consider that to be evidence of the effectiveness of the committee in defending the authority of the legislative branch. And I welcome your questions.
You'll recognize Ranking Member Heidkamp.
This is always a challenge because there's two functions, right? There is the oversight function, which we as legislators all believe is absolutely critical. And there isn't any of us who have ever been legislators who haven't said, that's not what we intended. I don't know why they're doing it that way. I mean, it seemed clear when we passed it. Why isn't it clear to them? But on the other side is this question of separation of powers and whether, in fact, the legislative branch being so critically involved and so strategically involved in regulatory analysis and potentially rewrite, that it flips over and results in a breach of that all-important separation of powers doctrine that is fundamental to state constitutions, fundamental to federal constitutions. So I want to explore kind of that line. And both of you, there's two of you who have basically said your states have confronted constitutional challenges. And the end result was a constitutional amendment in both cases, correct? In the case of Idaho and Connecticut. Can you just explain to me the various constitutional provisions you did enact, whether they were tailored very narrowly or whether it weighed on the side of greater participation of the legislature in implementation of legislation, or whether they really just help clarify what, in fact, was the oversight responsibility. Representative O'Neill, can you just explain kind of the constitutional development of your process?
Sure. As I mentioned, we had a court case, Maloney versus Pack. Lower court said we were unconstitutional, what the committee did, and the Supreme Court overruled it, but as I said, on technical grounds. So the constitutionality issue was never really resolved by the Supreme Court. And so very shortly after that decision came down is when the constitutional amendment was passed by the legislature and voted for by the public. And what that did was say a couple of things, one of which was that we clearly had the right to delegate the lawmaking function if we chose to administrative agencies. And the second thing was we also had the power to review and, if need be, reject, disapprove the regulations that were adopted by the agency. It was a very short amendment. It was a broad grant of authority, really, to the legislature to pass laws to implement that constitutional provision. And so what it really did was, I believe, and was intended to do at the time, was to ratify the system that we had already created up until that point, and to allow for its further development, because it would be a clear constitutional basis for the committee to do what it was doing. And I think that's pretty much what it has done. It did not really change the way the committee was structured or the way the committee operated.
Just legitimized it.
I'm sorry?
Just legitimized it.
Just legitimized it.
I don't want to belabor this, but I want to explain the challenges that we have, because there are federal court cases that talk about so-called legislative vetoes and whether that is in fact in violation of the continuum of responsibility under separation of powers. And so we don't have the luxury of a process that is very accessible for changing our Constitution. And so we have to make sure that when we're drawing those lines, that we're staying well on the side of legitimate oversight in terms of our legislative process. I, as a state agency head, both as Attorney General and as tax commissioner, spent a fair amount of time in front of the Administrative Rules Committee justifying the rules. I think that having that process, I will tell you honestly, made us much more conscious of our outreach, much more responsive to concerns, and maybe even resulted in amendments, because we knew we were going to have that level of immediate accountability, not just judicial review, but legislative review. And so I'm someone who has seen that process work, both as an agency head and as somebody who fully participated. And so with that said, we're trying to figure out how your lessons, which seem to work really well in your states, how that can be kind of adapted and adopted here. Representative O'Neill, can you talk a little bit, and I know I'm taking up some time, but I don't know, there's not a big, we're the nerds here, what can I tell you? Can you explain how you believe that the kind of party balance that you have in Connecticut affects your ability to do this work, or whether you see challenges?
Well, as I said, I think the bicameral, bipartisan nature of the committee helps it because there's not the sense that it's one party, that let's say the majority party also is the majority party on the committee, would give the sense that this is basically coming from a partisan perspective. One of the little watchwords, phrases that we sometimes hear is that the other party is the opposition, the executive branch is the enemy. So we kind of, and that's spoken by both Republicans and Democrats because we all have similar experiences in trying to deal with an executive branch agency that's being recalcitrant. So I think that we have a very partisan system. I mean, we do things on a very partisan basis in Connecticut. I'm surprised at sometimes when I talk to people from other states that the partisanship is not as intense. We can be bipartisan as well. We have institutionalized it in some places, such as this committee. And it occasionally occurs that there will be a 7-7 split along party lines, but that's fairly rare. And so most of the time, the committee speaks with one voice. It is a unanimous decision, and the executive branch, whether it's the governor or some commissioner who's trying to do something, or the treasurer, because we review their regulations as well, and so on, gets the impression this is the entity that is speaking on behalf of the legislature as an entity.
I just want to make this point before I turn it over. I think some of the hesitation is this idea that the executive gets elected, different political party than the legislative branch, and therefore there's an automatic way that you can limit the ability of the executive, who is of a different political party, to actually make decisions that are executive in nature and really executive. What's interesting about your process, and we've been kind of chatting a little bit about it up here, is it really is about a legislative prerogative versus an executive prerogative, and building that support for the overreach in the executive. It's not a political thing. It really is a thing that challenges the relationship between legislative and executive regardless of party.
Yes, if I could just point out, in the years that I've been on the committee, we had a Democratic governor, Bill O'Neill, when I first got on. Lowell Weicker, former United States Senator, was governor as an independent for 4 years. We had Republicans, and then now we have a Democratic governor. And the relationship between the committee and the executive branch has been pretty much the same consistently throughout all those different people with their different political perspectives and so forth.
So I have to ask the question, you said the relationship's been pretty consistent. Is that consistently bad or consistently good?
I would say generally it has mirrored the relationship that the governors have had with the legislature in general.
So if they're contentious, back to the legislature, it's the contentious committee as well?
Correct.
Because one of the challenges here in the conversation is it's no grand secret to the world that we have this very adversarial relationship at times with regulatory bodies here, where a law comes out, and then in our situation, not uncommon to have a year or 2 or 3 years later, the regulations that mirror up to that law come out, and they seem to be completely disconnected from the statute itself. And then you literally have a new legislature that wasn't the one that voted on it. It's now past an election cycle. There's a new legislature there, and this hostile connection between, was this the intent of Congress? Was this not the intent of Congress? So my question for all three of you, if you want to just give me a quick answer on it, has this process improved the dialogue between the regulators and the legislature? Or have you seen a difference on that? Or y'all have done it so long you haven't seen a real difference on it?
I think the dialogue is improved compared to what it used to be. Before this committee was really activated in the early 1960s, and even as late as the 1980s, there were a lot of secret regulations. Regulations were passed. You couldn't find them anywhere. The regulation books were years behind in terms of publication, and they were very hard to get a hold of. They weren't really even available in law libraries. Now we've got everything online. I mean, that's obviously the electronic revolution that's facilitated that. But I think the committee has produced and embedded into the process that the executive branch deals with the idea that they're going to have to explain all of this in public and answer, and even to the point where agencies will withdraw regulation. I didn't mention that, but they can withdraw regulations up until the very moment we take it up. because they're afraid that it will get rejected, and that's considered to be a mark of dishonor, so to speak, within the agency.
That'd be very helpful. By the way, there are secret regs in the federal government as well, among many, because it's a guidance where a regulated entity, a business, whatever it may be, will contact their regulator and will say, I need some advice on this, and they'll give them oral counsel on it, but won't put it in writing. And that becomes a big issue as well, because then it depends on your regulator, what your regulations are. Senator Carper.
Thanks. So my first question would be with Mr. O'Neill. Are you from Connecticut?
Yes, sir, I am.
My first question is, why do you always have such good women's basketball teams? Seriously.
Well, I would have to give a lot of the credit to the coach, Gino Auriemma, and once you've developed a great reputation, but there are a lot of good women basketball players in Connecticut. My daughter was a star at Trinity at one time.
No kidding. All right. All right. On a more serious note, I'm a recovering governor and had the opportunity to be chairman of the National Governors Association at one time. And I used to love to come before Congress and testify. And because Delaware was so close by, and I was the vice chairman and the chairman, I got called on quite a bit. I love to do that. I love to do that. You know why? Because the issues that they were discussing on most days, I actually knew more than they did about them. And it was just very helpful. And today, it's a kind of a reminder of that situation, because y'all know a lot more about this than some of us. And I've always said that the states can be laboratories of democracy, and this is a case where y'all can really help us out, and I think help out the country. I have not read verbatim your testimonies, but I'm going to ask each of you to just give me maybe the two most important points in your testimonies, so that I could just mull that over, and then I have a couple of questions. But just give me the two most important points in each of your testimonies. Mr. O'Neill, just two great takeaway points from you, please.
Yeah, I think the greatest strength of our system is that it's been institutionalized so that everyone accepts it. Our most recent governor, Governor Malloy, has been something of an exception. He's tried a couple of times to undermine or weaken the regulation review process, but the institution, the legislature, has resisted those efforts, and I think it's accepted regardless of party. And it is. And that
what's his motivation?
I think what he was claiming was that he wanted to streamline the regulation process by eliminating the review piece, which, of course, would streamline things, but then nobody would know necessarily what was going on or be able to act as a check, which was the whole point of the review. And
have you talked to him about this?
I've not personally directly. I've spoken with his aides that bring us these proposals and things like that, and they have said, well, because we think it would make things go more smoothly, or because he wants to deregulate a lot of things, he wants to pass deregulatory types of regulations, repeal things, and when repealers are done, we look at them as well. So that was suggested as the reason why he was trying to do that.
In Delaware, when our legislature was in session, we were in session off and on from January 1 through June 30th, and they were out for weeks at a time for doing the budgets and stuff like that. But whenever they're in session in Dover, if a legislator, House, Senate, Democrat, Republican, wanted to meet with me, I'd meet with them that day. I would meet with them that day. We'd find time.
Yeah. I don't know that Governor Malloy does that. And in fact,
you may want to meet with him and say, I talked to a recovering governor from Delaware, and he said this is what he did with his legislators. And we had I will say this, we had 8 great years that divided the Republican House, Democratic Senate, and got along probably as well with the House as with the Senate. And it works. It works. Okay, go ahead. Your second point is?
In addition to that is that I would say that another strength of ours is that, unlike what I'm hearing from the other members of the panel, we reject a lot of regulations. Now, that doesn't mean that they're dead forever, because they're supposed to bring them back right away and fix them and correct them. We disapprove, which is really kill the regulation forever, very rarely, once every 4 or 5 years. So we do have an ongoing dialogue after we reject the regulation with the agency. That's when we really get into a dialogue with the agency. If we look at what they've done and say, you got it wrong and here's why we think it's wrong, sit down and work with us, or more importantly, have your lawyers talk to our lawyers and work out the details. And that's when we, I think, are able to resolve conflicts and give the public a real opportunity to weigh in on those challenged ones, is when we have that dialogue of sometimes rejecting them 2 or 3 times before we get final approval.
Could I just ask one more? You mind?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. One says yes, the other says no. So, the Democrat said no. So I'm a Democrat. So that's bipartisan. Do you have look back? You know, one of the things Barack Obama did when he was president, as my colleagues will recall, is he asked, I think it was Cass Sunstein, who was the head of OIRA, OMB, asked him to do a regular look back and just look back at our existing regs and see which ones we ought to keep, which ones we ought to get rid of, and got rid of actually quite a few over time. Do y'all have that in that policy in your states, Mr. O'Neill?
Yes, we actually started doing that about 20 years ago. We passed legislation that required all of the agencies to review all of their regulations. We had a schedule of them to come in and report to us and tell us which ones ought to be removed from the books. And that worked well the first time we did it because there was a strong impetus to do it. They were supposed to come in on a 5-year rolling schedule to keep on doing this. That has not worked out. So what we recently did was we shifted the responsibility for handling that from the Regulation Review Committee to the substantive committee. So a transportation regulation would be brought over to the Transportation Committee to decide, because they have a more regular contact with an agency to decide about those kinds of things. So this is new. We haven't really seen how it worked. We just changed the law last year. But after the first go-around, it just never seemed to get off the ground again to keep going with that regularly scheduled review.
That makes sense. Okay.
I have a quick question. Have any of your states looked at judicial review and whether there had been a reversal of a lot of rules before your process, and whether in fact there's been a decline and probably maybe even an elimination of judicial reversal of regulations as a result of this process? One of the points that I'm trying to make is that listening to you all, we're worried about whether you're usurping executive authority, but you're almost acting like a first judicial review of the regulation. And so where we have focused on this separation of powers, a lot of what you're doing is what you would expect a court to do on the front end. And I'm just wondering if you've seen a reduction in the number of regulations that have been voided by the court because you've gone through this process.
Yeah, let me add one thing to that. Now, I definitely want to hear this answer. The court has the responsibility in law to define what the law says. You're actually saying, no, this is what the law says, and you're not following it as a regulation. So that's why we're jumping into this. And we have lots of follow-up questions on this issue of judicial review, but let's keep going.
We've been at it so long, it's hard to tell in terms of challenges, other than the PAC decision where it was voided, or the committee's authority was challenged as unconstitutional at the lower case court, and then later on was but that case was overturned but not resolved. We don't get a lot of court cases as far as I can tell. I certainly could go through and see if we can try to do a comparison. Things were so different in the way people would be able to go to court and challenge things back in the 60s, I would say, for regulations, before this committee really got rolling in the 70s, that it would be hard to do the comparison. I do know that periodically, when people do still challenge our regulations, we will hear, because we are told we have to subpoena all the records from the review committee's proceedings to bring to the court, because they're challenging a regulation on the grounds that something is being done either inconsistent with what the committee told them to do and what the regulation was rewritten to say, or they're claiming somehow that there was something wrong with what the committee did. But that doesn't happen on as far as I can tell, a very regular basis. My impression is that most issues that would provoke a court action are resolved at the committee level. And it's certainly one of the things I think of the strong points of this process is that you can avoid unnecessary litigation because you've got someone who, on the bureaucracy side, who simply won't listen. So that's my impression. We don't get a lot, but we still do get some.
Okay. Going back and looking at old regulations as well, for all 3 of your states, you could look at any regulation made at whatever year at whatever time. Is that correct, or is there a time limiting that you can only review it for the first year or once it's promulgated or finalized? Do you have the ability to be able to look at any regulation at any time? Representative O'Neill?
The committee cannot initiate that process other than through this legislation that we have that requires the agencies to periodically report. As I say, we just changed that. The committee gets regulations before they go into effect. They don't go into effect unless the committee approves them or lets them go through.
So your committee has the ability, they propose the rule, go through the final language, the committee has the conversation. Before it ever goes into effect, it has to be signed off by your committee.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, we actually have one of those cases pending right now. We had some legislation that called upon, I believe, the Public Health and the Department of Environmental Protection to develop some regulations jointly. They created the regulations, and then each of the commissioners wrote us a letter saying that these are terrible regulations, but we are doing what you asked us to do. And if you look at the consequences of imposing these kinds of regulations, you're going to be jeopardizing public health because it changes a lot of things about allowing people to sell foods that have not been properly tested and that sort of thing. Clearly, somebody had an idea. It went through the process, and it did not get carefully enough reviewed before it became statutory law. And so what we have done in the committee is, and this may be an example of us stretching, we said we're going to reject it, even though it does what the law says. We're rejecting it without prejudice, and don't bring it back until after the legislature's had a chance to sit down and review all of this again. So this also does create that kind of an opportunity for the agency to have a second go at the legislative process and say, did you really mean to do that? And we now have concluded, no, we really didn't.
It's extremely helpful. Gentlemen, thank you again. Let's keep the dialogue going as we try to work this out. At some point, when we finally get it all resolved, you'll be able to tell your grandchildren, I fixed that, and was a part of helping getting that resolved. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you all for being here. We'll make a final statement and announce the next hearing on it. Today's hearing is concluded. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until the close of business on November the 10th for the submissions of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.